Showtime! Welcome to the show. I'm Brent, Holland, and welcome one and all. It's been a long week, folks. A long week. You've worked hard. I've worked hard. I know that for sure. These guys have worked really hard. Take this time for yourself. Kick back in your most comfy chair. Get the coffee going. Get the tea going. Or get a beverage of choice going. Tonight we celebrate. We're going to celebrate the life and times of Robert Francis Kennedy, or simply, as we called him, Bobby. First of all, though, I want to thank all the veterans everywhere for today. It is also the anniversary of D-Day, June 6, 1944. If it wasn't for the fortitude and the courage of all those in service, this world would be under a swastika. Don't kid yourself. Thank you all for your service, everybody, everywhere. Bobby Kennedy was an icon of hope. Bobby Kennedy was born November 20th, 1925. The reason why I mentioned November 20th, don't forget, November 22nd, 1963, his brother would be murdered. So just 2 days before, Bobby celebrated his birthday. Now listen to this. November 27th is Caroline's birthday, and November 25th was John Jr.'s birthday. So imagine burying your father on your birthday. Think about that for a second. Yeah, little kids burying their dad on their birthdays. Bobby was the seventh child of businessman, politician Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. His brothers were Joe Kennedy, who died tragically in a suicide mission during World War II. President John Kennedy, of course, was assassinated, as I just mentioned, in 1963. And Ted Kennedy passed away from a brain tumor on August 25th, 2009. Tonight we're going to look at Bobby, his assassination, his brother's assassination, and what he thought the investigation he did on his own into his brother's assassination, Bobby's role in civil rights, his speech on April 4th, 1968 in Indianapolis. 2 months later, he would die himself on June 5th, 1968. We're also going to look at something different tonight, and this is why you tuned into the Brent Holland show. We're going to look at Ted Sorensen and what he told me on a personal, very personal level about Bobby's role, not only in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also in civil rights, and we're going to look at Bobby's legacy. Now, there's a funny story I want to share with you. And Bobby was closer to his mom than his dad for various reasons. Bobby was always considered the runt, quote-unquote, in the family. I mean, he had these big Godzilla guys in front of him. So he was the fourth boy in line, if you will. You know, Joe Kennedy Jr., there was Jack Kennedy after that, and Ted Kennedy. And then came poor little Bobby. Oh, I'm sorry. And then Ted was the baby, actually. So here's the story. Bobby, like his mom, he decided to become a very devout Catholic. Now, the funny story is, when he was a little boy, to impress his parents, like most kids in the era, he got a paper route. Now, what a paper route is, because they won't understand this. You know that, eh? I have to do translations. Okay, a paper route in the old days, people actually read newspapers. We're not so far along that people don't remember newspapers, I hope. But there used to be home delivery service, and very often it would be teenagers. I had one myself. Pick up a few extra bucks during the week, drop off the papers around 4:30, just in time for Dad, quote-unquote, getting home from the office, and he would read the paper while he was eating supper. Of course, the mom would make the supper. It was very traditional in those days. He had a paper route. What he didn't tell his parents, folks, was that he had his chauffeur drive him around in a Rolls Royce. True story. So the parents found out, and thus ended Bobby's venture into the newspaper business. Larry Hancock's with us again tonight, and Stuart Wexler. Larry is a heavy hitter in the JFK research community. Larry's book, Someone Would Have Talked, is a mainstay on the shelves of all serious JFK researcher. Larry has co-written, along with our other guest tonight, Stuart Wexler, also one of the best researchers in the business, one of the most important books about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. titled The Awful Grace of God. And that show can be found when we did the special April 4th this year on the anniversary of Mr. King's death. All those shows can be found by just either Googling Stuart Wexler Night Fright Show or Stuart Wexler Brent Holland Show. The same with Larry Hancock Brent Holland Show. All those shows will show up for you free to watch on YouTube. Okay, let's get to it, folks. Welcome to the show, guys. Thanks for joining me for this very, very special evening. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having us on.
It's one of history's greatest what-ifs. What if Bobby Kennedy had not been assassinated 40 years ago? And what would have happened had he become president of the United States, as was so much anticipated? Stu, can we start with you?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, obviously for the folks at home to know that the reverse was that we got Richard Nixon, and especially in the issue of foreign affairs, you know, Nixon wanted to have a strategic withdrawal from Vietnam. He did some fairly, frankly, a little bit extra legal things to try and make that happen in a way that would lead to an outcome that would have been beneficial to the United States. I think Bobby Kennedy probably would have accepted a more expedited removal of American armed forces from Vietnam. He still would have had to contend with, you know, the possibility or the problems with quote unquote cutting and running. But I think he was more determined to get out of Vietnam than Nixon was. Part of that was that he was also more so than Nixon, although Nixon, relative to Republicans, wasn't necessarily as far right when it came to domestic social spend programs as other Republicans would be. But he was still, Bobby, obviously a decent deal more to the left than Nixon was on social programs. He did want, I believe, I read something a while back that his thought was to do more of a public works type of program model along the lines of what you got during the New Deal. And that would have been interesting in terms of how that would have played out in the politics of the United States. But if I were to think about one big thing that I think our country really lost out on in having Richard Nixon as opposed to Bobby Kennedy, besides problems that happened a few years later with Watergate, is that I think our country would have been much better off in terms of issues related to race. Nixon played on the Southern strategy, which was sort of using dog whistle politics to appeal to the racial anxiety and animus that still lingered from the civil rights movement. And I think Bobby was one of the most sincere people, especially as of 1968. Might not have been true in 1961, but as of 1968, he was one of the most sincere people we ever had, I think, run for office on the issue of civil rights. So you compare the contrast between Southern strategy type politics and what Bobby would have brought to the table. I think America, and I mean, it's always speculation, would have been in a lot better place in terms of race relations than we were as a result of the Nixon presidency and 2 terms of Nixon.
I want to stay on that comparison to Richard Nixon for a second, and I'll go to Larry for this one. Larry, everybody argues that had it not been for Nixon, China wouldn't have been opened up. Of course, he also dealt with the Russians as well, Nixon. Do you think Bobby would have achieved something similar to that?
I think Bobby would. Now, I would have to say that I'm not sure that the China policy was really as much a Nixon policy as it was a Kissinger policy to oppose the Soviet Union. Everybody seems to think it was really a positive type move. I see it very much as a defensive strategic move on Kissinger's part. Would Bobby have done that? I think the real question is how Bobby would have extracted himself from Vietnam. And that would have shaped what happened with China. Nixon allowed it to drag on. He was very hard-nosed about the process, essentially had a fighting disengagement. I think Bobby, very much a pragmatist like his brother, might have moved much more quickly, and if he had moved towards a softer disengagement more quickly from Vietnam, it could have taken us towards an opening with China sooner. But Brent, I would like to make one comment because when I was there, I think everybody seems to take it for granted that RFK would have been the nominee if he had lived. I will tell you, I'm not sure what would have happened at the Democrat convention. I watched that live. I was on campus. I watched all the candidates visit campus. And I will tell you that in terms of sheer enthusiasm on campus that spring among the really avid Democratic supporters, RFK was actually in third place.
Really? I'm surprised to hear that.
I went to see his rally, and his rally was modestly attended compared to the McCarthy supporters, of which I was one at that point in time. We really, again, have to go back in history, but we saw RFK as not yet taking the kind of stand that we want him to. That might have gelled, and he might have swept the convention, but I don't know. I couldn't foresee what would happen at that convention. It would have had to be everyone coming together in a special moment, because there was a lot of divisiveness and a lot of very hot-headed
that's fair enough.
opponents of the Vietnam War.
Okay. I tend to think he probably would have taken it because of the overwhelming support that he got in Los Angeles. Now, what campus were you on at the time?
I was in New Mexico, University of New Mexico, and at the time I can remember getting a teletype message because we had lots of protests going on, and we had bayonettings during the protests, blood spilled, and our campus was considered probably to be the most liberal anti-war campus in between Berkeley and the East Coast.
Okay, fair enough. Now, there's a big push right now in the media to try and spin Jared Kushner, who is President Trump's son-in-law, to be the next Bobby. They're trying to compare him to Bobby. Let's stay with Larry on this one. Larry, what do you think? Is he the next Bobby? Is he the parallel to what JFK had with Bobby?
The interesting thing is they're positioning Jared, I think, as an asset to President Trump in the same way that Bobby was. I mean, Bobby did embark on a lot of individual initiatives. There's no doubt about that. Bobby did exchange and back channel activities, very, very important back channel activities in regard to Berlin, the Bay of Pigs, not the Bay of Pigs, sorry, the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what we have to remember is Bobby was, at the point in time he was serving as a back channel, he was Attorney General, he was on the National Security Council, he was working hand in glove with his brother, and his brother gave him the marching orders, and what he was doing was there weren't any rogue activities. He wasn't doing individual meetings on his own. He was taking marching orders from Jack, and I see that as it's in no way comparable to what Kushner was doing even before Trump took office, and in no way comparable to what's happening under the Trump administration. It looks to me like Jared is very much as out of sync with our president right now. And that never happened with Bobby and Jack. They were always in sync. Jack might have used him as a stalking horse, but he knew what he was doing when he did that. So, no, I don't see them as comparable at all.
Yeah, if I could add to that.
Please do, Stu.
You know, the way Kushner was sold to us as an advisor, dating back into the campaign, was he was some kind of Trump whisperer who could calm down Trump and get him off of Twitter and all these kinds of things. And none of that is materialized. And is just as Larry just said, Bobby and Jack were kind of partners. You never had to worry about Bobby having to soften JFK's rough edges. If anything, say during the missile crisis, Jack Kennedy had to calm down Bobby at times, right? So, we're sold on we were sold on, Jared Kushner knows how to keep Trump in line. No one apparently does. And once that's in, then we don't get any of the benefits of a Bobby. and we get all the negatives of a Trump. So I think it's a big-time historical disanalogy there.
Folks, if you're just joining us, we're talking about Bobby Kennedy tonight. It was, all those years ago, right? 1968, June 4th, 5th, and 6th, 1968. That was the night that Bobby attended the Ambassador Hotel, and he was assassinated and later died on the very June 6th that we're celebrating right now. Can one of you guys walk us through what happened June 4th, 5th, and 6th, 1968 at the Ambassador Hotel? Larry, perhaps?
Sure. There were a series of events. I think it's important to remember that this was not RFK's very first visit to the ambassador. And that's an important thing because he had been there for a rally previously. And in the context of the overall assassination, the interesting thing is that Sirhan and Sirhan had also been reported there previously at the same time Bobby was scheduled to appear. So RFK was campaigning. He was campaigning in Los Angeles primarily, making a variety of appearances all over the city. Very visible figure. His campaign was going on. Had several campaign offices. And it was a rough day for Bobby, as a matter of fact, obviously during the primary. And the setup, the context of the assassination, again, a lot of what went on in regard to the assassination goes on independently of Bobby, because Bobby was upstairs in the Ambassador Hotel watching returns. Bobby had been very stressed. He'd been tired. He was actually engaged he had gone out swimming and had gotten in a tidal current and had barely gotten out of it, as a matter of fact. So he was physically tired, and he gave his aides instructions that he really wasn't up to facing the crowds again. And everybody had been planning for his appearance after the election results got in.
When he was, I just wanted to mention, folks, when he was out swimming, he also saved his son's life because his son started to drown, and he pulled him to shore. Sorry to interrupt you, Larry.
Oh, no, that's I should have said that. That's very important. But the point is, Bobby was without doubt tired, without doubt emotionally exhausted. And when you get into examining the assassination in detail, his activities later that evening when he went to speak weren't as planned. I mean, it had been planned that he would go in and he would enter through crowds and be highly visible to the crowds. And he expressed to his aides that he wasn't up to that. He'd done enough of that. And so what we find him doing is late that evening when he finally goes down quite late and after he was scheduled to appear to address the crowd in the Ambassador, which was an overflow crowd, a hugely overflow crowd. He goes in and asks to be taken, in to speak, avoiding the crowd. Goes down a service elevator, goes into a service pantry, through a kitchen, service pantry that provides food to all the banquet rooms and meeting rooms, and goes up and goes onto the stage to address the crowd. He makes his fairly short speech. After that, again, his aides are expecting him that he traditionally likes to interact with the public. Well, he doesn't go to the press room for a scheduled appearance through the crowd. He again exits back through the service lobby the same way he came in. And one of the things we have to contend with, and that may have contributed to the assassination, is that he had come in through that service pantry. Anyone with malicious intent would have seen him come in and could well be prepared for him to leave the same way, which is what appeared to happen. So it's really kind of sad in a way. We have another one of those instances where if Bobby had gone in through the crowds, who knows what would have happened, maybe something very different. But that evening didn't come off exactly as had been anticipated, and he was fatally shot in the service pantry.
And he passed away on June 6th. Now, there's a lot of anomalies around this thing. I would like to go to Stu for this. Stu, do you feel it was a premeditated murder by Sirhan Sirhan? Do you think he was even involved, Sirhan Sirhan?
Well, I think Larry and I are both on board on the fact that he was more involved than most want to admit, and less involved to some extent than the lone assassin that he's been painted as in the official version. And I do believe it was premeditated in the sense that Sirhan he appears to be at other places prior to the assassination on June 5th, where Bobby is. He's essentially appears to be stalking him. But what gets ignored, and you could go in both ways, your listeners, presumably, but maybe not, are pretty familiar with the issues and controversies surrounding his brother's assassination and Martin Luther King's assassination. And I always say to people, even though we have, pictures of the guy who killed him, straight up in front of where Bobby was, the actual evidence, both in terms of complicity of others and the actual mechanisms of the crime, to me, is more convincing of the official version being wrong than in either of the other two assassinations. And that goes for the fact that, let's, for instance, imagine what would be the case right now if we actually knew in both JFK and MLK, point blank, 100%, that the gun was not the gun purchased by the alleged shooter. Somebody else got the gun and was in presence of the people, not speculative where you're debating out witnesses, but rather convincingly other people were in the presence of the shooter when he was practicing shooting. And then you get to the actual shooting event, and the bullet hole in the back of Bobby Kennedy's head is way, way too large to be the result of the caliber of bullet and gun that we know Sirhan had. And that's just one anomaly in the shooting.
Yeah, can I just stay there for a second? Just let folks know. Now, Sirhan Sirhan was, or Sirhan Sirhan, was always in front of Bobby Kennedy, and this is one of the anomalies I'm going to relay to you right now, because Stu just mentioned the wound in the back of Bobby's head. Now, it came in, the shot that killed him came into Bobby's head just behind his right ear, if I'm not mistaken, less than 2 inches, according to the coroner, from the gun. Now, Sirhan Sirhan was never less than 4 feet and always in front of Bobby. So now we have another magic bullet that seems to do a U-turn in midair and come in through Bobby's head, if we're to believe the official story. And it's one that I just can't support.
That's one anomaly. I mean, some people try and argue maybe Bobby somehow turned or something. But one thing that's 100%, and John Hunt deserves a lot of credit for this, there's no doubt that there's no way, just no physical possible way, that a .22 fired at point-blank range could create an entry wound as large as the one you have in RFK's head. So it's not just trajectory issues, it's wound ballistics issues in the skull. And that's not even getting to the whole issues of this whole crazy ricochet scenario, where you seem to have a pretty clear evidence that there are bullet holes, like in pictures, right? FBI agents attest to actually... Yeah, there was bullets in the bullet holes.
So we've got a gun that holds, I think it's 8 bullets Sirhan Sirhan's supposed to be holding in his hand that did all this damage, and yet we can count between 13 and 14 bullet holes and account for 13 and 14 bullets. Once again, as with the John Kennedy assassination, there's a lot of questions and a lot of unanswered anomalies, once again, without question. What was the biggest one for you, Larry? What's the biggest anomaly there for you?
I think the biggest anomaly is that, as Stu mentioned, there are very solid reports from numbers of people of Sirhan stalking RFK. In fact, there's one report from an event that RFK attended a few days before it, upstairs in a restaurant. It was a private political meeting, and there were 2 individuals that managed to penetrate security, get into the restaurant, long story. You can read about it elsewhere. But the point is, there are these numerous incidents and numerous descriptions of these people being the same. Two men, a woman, description of Sirhan, a description of either Sirhan and or his brother, the description of the woman being consistent. And this happens at the Ambassador Hotel again throughout the evening. Over some 3 hours in the hotel, there are probably 15 to 20 individual witness observations of putting these people in the Ambassador Hotel, moving around in the area where Bobby's going to be, and in conjunction with someone looking like Sirhan Sirhan, even into the pantry that I mentioned before. Now, the reason this is such a great anomaly to me is LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department, was very much aware of how indicative of conspiracy this was. And for several weeks in their investigation, they realized that the crux of their investigation was identifying these people and locating them, locating in particular a young woman referred to as the polka dot dress girl. When they failed to find that woman, they essentially had to face up to the fact that they had not solved the case, that they had not resolved the conspiracy, and so they committed an atrocious act with one of the witnesses involving a bogus lie detector test given to someone that they actually took drinking before the lie detector test, and wrote off all of those witness observations based on one polygraph test, which can be proven to be false. And to me, that's the biggest anomaly, because it shows that the LAPD was essentially complicit in settling on a lone gunman because they really couldn't solve the crime.
I want to go back to Stu now. Larry, thanks for bringing up the girl in the polka dot dress, by the way. That just ruined my next question for Stu. So now I'm pivoting. Thane Eugene Caesar, can you interject his alleged role in this as well? Now, I got to tell you, Dan Moldia was on the show a few months ago, and he was adamant that Thane Eugene Caesar was innocent. He had given him a lie detector test. But can you give us an overview, Stu, of who he was?
So, part of the issue here is when you start getting into the problems with especially the headshot with Robert Kennedy, there's not room there for, snipers to be hanging around 100 yards away. The shot had to have come from very close range. So now you're in a situation as to who could have possibly have shot Robert Kennedy from close range if Sirhan wasn't that person, and I don't believe Sirhan was. And so one of the people who's been suggested by more than one researcher is a private security guard by the name of Thane Eugene Caesar, who did unholster his weapon. And the thought process of some folks is that maybe even accidentally, some people think, possibly intentionally, he panics and unloads a round into RFK's head. And, the tricky thing there is again, we don't have the ballistics. The LAPD did a massive amount of covering up. And, I tend to, and again, I defer to some other people on this. The one person who I talk to a lot about it is John Hunt when it comes to ballistics. And I know John is not very well convinced that it would have been Caesar's gun either that would have caused the kind of wound that you got in the back of RFK's skull. But there's some suspicious stuff related to Caesar. And again, you have a limited number of people who could have even possibly have done it. So he's a candidate to a lot of people.
What's the suspicion around him? Now, I should just tell you, folks, Thane Eugene Caesar was standing behind Bobby, and he fell down when the shots rang out. He did pull his weapon, and Bobby Kennedy's shot is from the ground up, if you will. So it kind of points a spotlight on Thane Eugene Caesar, that he might have been part of this thing because he was on the ground in a pretty good position behind Bobby. There was also some other upshots that went through Bobby's clothes and things of that nature. How was Thane Eugene Caesar connected to something nefarious or people that were nefarious? Stu?
Well, I mean, I believe that one of the things was that he worked for a company, and you can make some indirect connections between that company and possibly people who wanted to have RFK killed. I think his politics, to the extent that people know about them, wouldn't have been friendly to RFK. So you have that. Frankly, I don't think that's been something, and one of the reasons why I'm skeptical also of his possible involvement. I don't think it's been that element was established well enough for you to say, well, what's the motive here, other than maybe a political motive.
Okay, fair enough. I think.
Brent,
yes, please. Go
if
ahead,
I could
Larry.
comment on that,
Yes, sir.
One of the problems is there's an alternative, and we've kind of hit around that. One of the reasons he is suspicious is because he clearly did obfuscate, make misstatements, and actually lie about his ownership of a weapon, his own personal weapon that could have related to the shooting. And that weapon ended up amazingly at the bottom of a pond in Arkansas. And his behavior in regard to that weapon has raised a lot of questions like, well, wait a minute, if he was dishonest about that and apparently covering up something about that, what else should we worry about? That's kind of helped make a case against him as being suspicious. But we need to keep in mind, and I don't know how this would really go off in the polygraph, but it is quite possible that at the time, because both men did fall to the ground, and because Caesar did admit to pulling his weapon, that he could have fired a shot accidentally. The police did not collect his weapon that night. There's no ballistics done on him, nothing on his hand. He wasn't really investigated in that regard to quite some time. And it raises the question to me whether he got himself into a trap, having done something that possibly he didn't even understand at the time, and then later not wanting to admit it, so that he could truthfully answer a question that said, well, no, I didn't shoot RFK. Well, there's a quandary to that. Maybe not intentionally, and maybe he didn't even know that he did it accidentally because that was never investigated.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent, Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Dealey Plaza. First-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. www.nightfrightshow.com.
I want to jump back to Stu real quick now. Stu, what were the officials saying that was Sirhan Sirhan's motive for doing this? And as an extension to that also, I want to cover the fact, the rumors, if you will, not the fact, the rumors that perhaps Sirhan Sirhan was under some kind of hypnotic control. Can you talk to that?
Well, to the first question, the motive has largely been attributed to the fact that Sirhan Sirhan, his family is connected to Palestine, that he would have shot RFK as sort of a protest, seeing RFK as being sympathetic to Israel, and that it was almost like one of the first acts. One person wrote a book that it was called him the first terrorist. There would have been a first act of, Middle Eastern related terrorism. In terms of and again, I should add, we'll maybe explore it. There's some people who think that doesn't hold up as well as maybe some other motives that connect to other kinds of people who might have been a part of it. The claim that Sirhan Sirhan was some kind of Manchurian candidate who was programmed, I'm highly skeptical of that claim. Where it's rooted in is that he was at the very least actively engaged in forms of self-hypnosis. If you look at his diary or his journal, it bears a lot of almost what you would call hypnotic writing, where he's just writing the same things over and over again, including things like RFK must die. And so you get this whole avenue, and plus a lot of people who the handful of people who interacted with him directly after the shooting described him as almost being maybe trance isn't the best word. Possessed might be an even better word. But there's some alternative explanations for some of these things. One of the things that seems to convince me is that perhaps he was drugged and given drugs, for instance, by the polka dotted dress girl, to get him into a state where he'd be willing, almost like liquid courage, they say, to a point where he might be willing to go through with it, where he otherwise might not have had the sort of decisiveness or assertiveness to do it. And the other thing, just with MK Ultra in general, it's not something that's very easy to do, according to all of the studies that I have seen, to hypno-program somebody to do something like a killing. So I've always thought that Sirhan has used that as a crutch, probably to avoid saying who did help him with the assassination. And that's where I've come down with that over the years.
Larry, do you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, I think to some extent we've allowed that question to divert us. And my thought would be, as Stu mentioned, Sirhan Sirhan clearly hated RFK. There's just no doubt about that. His family admitted that. Sirhan admitted that. Sirhan admitted talking to himself, and even in some of his trance sessions, addressing the question of killing RFK. So there's no doubt that Sirhan at least considered killing RFK, that he would have been, the only question is, did he literally do it himself? There's also no question in my mind that he took a gun into the pantry and shot at RFK and wounded several people. So from that aspect, Sirhan is not innocent. At best, he's an accessory, at least he's an accessory to murder, if not murder. And we kind of let that divert us from the larger question of the conspiracy, which is the real question. It's not a question to me of Sirhan's mental guilt or innocence. It's a real question of who was behind the assassination of RFK and what their motive was.
In your opinion, Larry, same people that were behind RFK, behind JFK?
Probably not. Stu and I both, we've tried that. I will, just for reference, I wrote an extended, almost book-length study of this that people can find on the Mary Farrell site under the RFK section of the Mary Farrell site. It's called Incomplete Justice. And one of the things I bring it up is you'd asked me to sketch the context at the Ambassador. I had a great deal of help in preparing graphics and illustrations and things. Sherry Feister did some wonderful graphics that show the movements of people that evening. And folks that are interested in this should look through that to get the right background. But to answer your question, we looked at that, and certainly other people have. And there are connections that tie Sirhan Sirhan to the ultra-right. There are connections that tie him to other special interests out of the Middle East. My guess, and Stu can back me up on this, point is the reason Stu and I haven't written a book on this is we couldn't reach a conclusion, and we didn't feel it deserved writing a book if we couldn't at least reach a sane hypothesis. My personal opinion is if somebody got to Sirhan, I think it's probably more likely that it was the people that killed Martin Luther King rather than JFK.
Isn't that interesting? Okay, there's some more weird coincidences here, folks. Lisa Pease came on the show. She's a top-notch researcher in her own right, and she talked about Bobby's assassination and the girl with the polka dot dress. She seems to be a fixture, the girl with the polka dot dress, some kind of handler for Sirhan Sirhan or something to do with it. She was telling me that the police actually found a bra and panties and a polka dot dress. So, oh, you're nodding your head, Larry. Okay, I'm going to go back to you. I'm not avoiding you, Stu. But Larry's nodding his head in agreement or something. Go ahead, Larry.
Lisa's done wonderful work on the polka dot dress girl. That's one of the reasons Stu and I are split which direction to go. But yeah, they found a brown paper bag This would have been on the way to the airport, in the vicinity of the airport. And the fascinating thing is it not only contained the right kind of dress, the right kind of shoes, the right kind of underwear, including, I have to say, a bra size that matched the girl in the polka dot dress who had rather distinctive physical attributes. And it was like and it had never been worn, or at most one time. It was like brand new and thrown away. And that's, again, the police managed to ignore that. It's in the record. But I think the polka dot, to me, the polka dot dress girl is the key figure. No doubt about that.
Okay, there's another coincidence, folks. If we back up to 1963, right inside Dealey Plaza, just a few minutes after JFK is assassinated, there's a fellow by the name of Eugene Brading this time, not the same guy as the other Eugene we were talking about. Eugene Brading was arrested in a building called the Daltex building that many people feel some assassination shots came from. So he was arrested and released. Then it was later found out he had changed his name, and he was actually a known, a small-time mafioso bagman, if you will. So the coincidence of him being in Dealey Plaza right at the very second that JFK was assassinated is weird. His excuse for being there was even weirder. He said he heard about the assassination, wandered upstairs to look for a telephone. No cell phones, right, folks? You had to find a telephone to call his mom and let his mom know that the president had been shot. Yeah. Fast forward 5 years, just a few blocks from the Ambassador Hotel, Bobby Kennedy is lying there in a pool of his own blood. Guess again who's arrested for questioning our very same friend, Mr. Brading. Coincidence? I'll leave that up to you. But I want to talk about Bobby's reaction to the JFK assassination. I'm going to go back to Stu for this. Stu, can you tell us where Bobby was when he first heard of his brother being shot and who told him in that whole scenario?
So from what I recall, Bobby was in Virginia, and when he found out about it, I don't remember exactly who told him, but the account where it gets very interesting is what Bobby does in the immediate aftermath of finding out, which is he starts making phone calls to people like John McCone, who's the head of the CIA, to Harry Williams, who's one of his closest associates amongst the Cuban exile community. And it's clear that Bobby is already very suspicious about what happened with his brother in 1963. And what we've found out since is that he was kind of running his own little private investigation for years. And he was tapping into resources and people, connections with him, with his family, and almost doing his own parallel investigation. So he had somebody in Chicago, a guy named Jules Drasnin, who was running down the potential leads related to Sam Giancana. He had people in New Orleans, Walter Sheridan, who was running down leads potentially related to Carlos Marcello. He had people in French intelligence who were running down leads in relation to H.L. Hunt. He had a guy go over to the Soviet Union, and this is in David Talbot's book, looking into KGB involvement. And from what we understand is he did not buy into the Warren Commission's conclusions. Publicly, he had to give support, and that he was trying to maneuver himself in part into a position where he felt he could have the power and the access to really potentially run this down. So he
what
had
were the final conclusions that he became aware of? Was he on the side that Oswald acted alone, or did he think it was a bigger conspiracy than that?
Oh, from everything we understand from these people who he tapped into, it wasn't very long before he threw aside the idea of Oswald as a lone nut assassin. There is some conflicting stuff you hear about where he ultimately was in terms of who he thought from his own little private investigation might have been involved. And in fact, you could have overlap, but there's one argument that you hear that he was kind of settled on Marcello. And then there's an argument that you get from Talbot that he was more interested in the security services of the United States. Of course, there's potential overlap there. They both worked together to kill Castro, but I don't know for my own, sense of things from reading these things if he was definitive on exactly who, but it seems like he was pretty clear-cut that it was not Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone.
Larry, do you feel that perhaps his investigation into his brother's death and the fact that he had mentioned that he would probably open it up in private, do you think that had anything to do with his own death?
No, I really don't, honestly. And I do think that Bobby tried to collect certain information. An interesting anecdote is we learned later on that JFK's doctor and the close friend of the Kennedy family actually ended up with a good deal of the medical evidence, the physical evidence, and actually took possession of it. And it did not end up with the Secret Service or anyone else. And even years later, there were questions about
Larry,
what the doctor had.
Sorry to interrupt. Was JFK's brain involved with that?
Correct.
Okay.
The brain was involved.
So it was not buried with the body.
There again, it's speculative, but there's some thought that again early on that RFK was certainly aware or suspicious that this was a conspiracy, and that that evidence needed to be sequestered, possibly for a future investigation. But we've got a real disconnect between, the sorts of things he was doing in private and the sorts of positions he was taking publicly. That's one of the most fascinating things about it, because
your speculation on why he was doing that?
I think, well, first of all, I think he was conflicted. I don't think there was any clear line of thought. He was clearly emotionally stricken and probably going off in different tangents at the same time. So I think talking about him as if he was fully rational and, acting in a straight line manner is probably not right. I think that explains some of it. I think it was situational. The behavior at Bethesda that evening may well have been different situationally than the behavior in terms of his cooperating and suppressing information out of Mexico City. I don't think it's simple, but I do think at this distance in time, it's fair to say that it wasn't just RFK. I'd like to hear Stu's idea, but my feeling is both RFK and Jackie, the Kennedy family, the insiders of the Kennedy family, including their top aides, never thought that it was a lone nut gunman.
Yeah, we know that for sure because two of Kennedy's most trusted allies, if you will, Dave Powers and also Kenny O'Donnell, were in the follow-up car inside the Secret Service car, and they said that they saw the shots coming from, quote-unquote, the Grassy Knoll. That's in Lamar Waldron's book, as a matter of fact, and I know you guys have covered this as well. Stuart, what did the assassination do to Bobby? Now, there was a lot of talk that the reason why Oswald was killed by unknown mafioso Jack Ruby was because the mob was somehow involved with the assassination because Bobby was so hell-bent in going after them. As a matter of fact, we know that we had mentioned Sam Giancana before. He was a mob boss from Chicago, Carlos Marcello from New Orleans. Interesting story about Carlos Marcello where Bobby had him picked up unceremoniously in his pajamas taken to an airplane and then dropped off in Central America in his pajamas and just left there. So obviously Marcello would be angry over this. He was going after Hofta from the Teamsters Union, who was also involved with the mafia. Did Bobby blame himself for going after the mafia as one of the reasons why his brother was murdered? Stuart?
Well, there's some speculation in this regard. He was very clearly grief-stricken, as you might expect. There's some suggestions that he felt pangs of guilt, but it's difficult to disentangle, was it because he thought there was a mafia connection, or was it because he thought that in going after Castro, that, and I think Larry and I are probably in agreement, and this won't get us into certain fan clubs in the JFK research community, that the Kennedys were a little bit more aggressive than people would like to think about going after Castro than people want to admit to. And out of that can emerge, I frankly don't think it's a very credible theory, but you could go the Castro route and feeling guilty over that. But you could also go very clearly to whether or not, Bobby had his favored anti-Castro exiles. But in the process of favoring a certain select group, he also gravely angered the most right-wing, super patriotic elements of both the CIA component of the anti-Castro cause and the actual exiles, the most right-wing exile groups. And so, one of the things he said to Harry Williams, although there's a little bit of confusion on this, is one of your guys did this, didn't they? And kind of hung up on him. This is right after the assassination. And again, Harry Williams is one of his favored exiles. But outside of Harry Williams' little clique, there are a lot of exiles who despise the Kennedys. So his guilt could have extended, if it does extend, to him thinking that he had some indirect, connection to why his brother got shot. It could connect to Mafia maybe, but it could connect to Castro maybe. But, I tend to favor the idea that he got the sense that maybe some of the anti-Castro folks, broadly speaking, and he was into anti-Castro games, so to speak,
Operation
that may have gotten his brother killed. But it's speculative.
Okay, we've only got a few minutes left, and I want to get to this. Larry, one of the things he suspected right away that perhaps the CIA was involved, as Stu just mentioned. As a matter of fact, can you tell that story about what he said to John McCone, who was handpicked by the Kennedys, or I should say Jack Kennedy, to head the CIA after he fired Allen Dulles for the Bay of Pigs fiasco? Can you tell us that story?
Yes, interestingly enough, that afternoon after the assassination, McCone actually went to and visited our RFK, which is kind of interesting because you'd expect him to be doing his job maybe. But Bobby said that he asked, it's clear, and Stu said it, his first thoughts that afternoon after the assassination were, number one, that it was Cuban exiles, and number two, that it might have been elements of the CIA. Whatever went on later, those were in the forefront of his mind. He asked the CIA director if it was the CIA, and later he said that the CIA director had assured them that it could not have been, which honestly I've always found very confusing because Bobby was very politically sophisticated, and he knew that CIA director at the top of his agency had only been there a brief time. How could he possibly give him an assurance like that and Bobby would accept it? To me, that almost sounds like a sort of denial because the CIA director is not going to know if some of his people down in Miami were involved in this.
Agreed completely. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I just want to talk about his legacy. And I want to talk about something called the Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation, which Bobby started in 1965. He was the senator for New York, and he went into a very impoverished area, and he said, what is the best way, instead of just throwing money around at trying to fix the problem, how can we give these people work? So he started this restoration corporation. Essentially what he did was he partnered with private business to come in and restore facades and things of that nature, buildings, but he hired the people living in that area, and he gave them jobs, he gave them money, and he gave them hope. Now, it was started in 1965, and to this day, as late as, I think it was 2015 or 2016, there's been 2,200 housing units in the neighborhood. It's provided mortgage financing to nearly 1,500 homeowners. It's brought, are you ready for this? $375 million in investments to the community. And here's my favorite part, because I'm all about jobs. It's created over 20,000 jobs. Now, this really pissed Lyndon Johnson off. As a matter of fact, a lot of people were pushing for Bobby to be on the 1964 ticket to be vice president, and Lyndon Johnson just outright said no. So, your final thoughts, Stuart? We'll go with you, and we'll end off with Larry on the legacy of Bobby Kennedy.
Well, I think you hit on something right there. I really do think, again, that part of the result of the assassination of his brother was that he was chastened. He was not the sort of, strong man that he was in the early Kennedy administration. I think he was a much more compassionate and empathetic person in '68 when he was running. And I think it's a real loss for America that we didn't get a chance to have somebody like that in office,
Larry,
potentially, if he would have won.
My thought is, as with Jay, pragmatic. It's pragmatism.
Thank you, Stuart Wexler, Larry Hancock. Their book, of course, Awful Grace of God. You can find that show, www.nightfrightshow.com. I'm Brent Holland. Thank you all for joining us. Too bad about the music. I could go for another couple of hours. Thank you guys so much, as always.
Thank you again.
Take care. Bye-bye now.